Teachers of Reddit, when have you met the parents of a student and suddenly understood their behavior? I've met a lot of parents of great kids and it totally makes sense that their kid is great because they're super nice and polite and normal. But I know people are here for the horror stories. I taught kindergarten for the first part of my career. My last year in K I had a girl who was possibly the brattiest child I ever met. She had no qualms telling me no when I'd ask her to do something totally reasonable, was mean and nasty to the other kids. Just a total nightmare. At meet the teacher night, she came with her mum, despite me asking parents to leave their children at home unless absolutely necessary, and was totally disruptive and noisy, and mum said nothing. Mum stuck around to ask me a question at the end and her daughter was covering her mouth as she was trying to speak. The mother just eventually gave up trying to ask me anything. I was so shocked I didn't even know what to do. A kid I had the year before was another hot mess. I had a really small class that year, which never happens in an urban public school, and it was so great for their social development. Except this kid. He didn't want to learn his classmates' names and didn't want to play with them. Fair enough. But he would also interrupt them when it was their turn to talk because he wanted it to be his turn. Everything had to be about him, or he'd throw a fit. He did no work, and was well behind all of the other kids. I met with the parents about his progress and they just laughed and shrugged. That's just his personality, he's the star. They also didn't make him do any of the extra work I sent him to help him catch up because he didn't feel like it. I was so happy to watch him walk out of my door on the last day of school. I worked as a teaching assistant at a school last year. One 8-year-old kid was incredibly competitive and would threaten other students who were in second or third place in competitions to stay in their place so that he could win something, and he would become incredibly red-faced and stressed. He would literally threaten his peers. He even threatened to kill other students over a competition of who could make this little robot move within taped lines on the floor. He would become completely irrational during competitions, it was crazy. Then his parents came in for school sports day and had a full meltdown when they didn't win the jokey parent race we do at the end of the day. They accused other parents of cheating because they had sports shoes on, whereas other parents had just come from work, so they just did the race barefoot. The dad went as far as demanding a rematch on a more level surface. Other parents just did a funny pose at the start line to make the kids laugh, ran the race, and beeping went home. Had a kid who would struggle to listen to anything or follow directions. When told what to do he would break down. Eventually got him to start listening a little bit. Met his mum. She lets him do whatever he wants. Even write on the walls in their house. She's too scared to tell her own child no. Small kid in grade 4, 9 years old, threatened another kid on the playground with a jackknife and said I'm gonna kill you. Called in his mother who was quite appalled and then warned us about his father. Exactly as she said, the man was unhinged. Within a few minutes he was raging angry and threatening the administrators. He was escorted off campus. Later he threatened to come back and the campus was locked down for the only time I remember in its history and police were alerted. That poor kid has no chance of growing up normal. His dad is a bomb with an extremely short fuse. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree is so very true. Literally just posted about this, but I work at an after school program and we have all K5 kids. There is a 4th grader who has to be the center of attention. He has to win every game. He will fake an injury to avoid losing / being it. He says and does pretty nasty things to kids he sees as less than him. He's a bigger kid, so he easily overpower a lot of kids his age. And when we would go to his mother about his actions she would say that we lied and he would never do whatever he did. It didn't matter how many adults and students saw him do it, she denied and would then get upset with us. She'd say we are picking on him because he stands out. He echoes these words whenever he's in trouble, and it's a never-ending cycle that we can really do nothing about because there's nothing being done at home. There's a boy in my class who hits children and laughs about it, most often with a small disturbing smile as the other kid freaks out. We've told his parent repeatedly, and she stands there with her arms crossed looking at us like we should go die. Then she smiles at her son. and asks in an overly cheerful voice if he wants to get ice cream / go to the movies, play mini golf, essentially rewarding him for this behavior. It's so beeping infuriating. But it makes sense, because it's right there. I was fired from my job as an aftercare worker for kids around 5 years old for telling the mother this exact thing about her daughter. The mother could not care less and took her demon spawn to see Santa. The daughter would take her hairpins off her head and try to stab other children in the eyes with them, all while laughing. But beat me, right? Just trying to make sure she didn't send anyone to the hospital. On what grounds were you fired? Certainly not for literally just informing the mother that her daughter had assaulted other children. If a parent wants you fired and threatens to yank their child from your care and take their money with them, in most child care places you are fired. Easier to replace a worker and get one that's not a problem than to avoid an angry review, I guess. Shit's beeped and thankless. Here's a lighter one. I had a student who always left their homework at school, always left their report at school, always left letters at school. I assumed it was all accidental to avoid their parents knowing about school things. Then we had parents' evening, and I had a lovely conversation with their mum. Mum asked for a particular sheet of information and made notes on it. Then she got up and left, and I realized she left the sheet behind on the desk just like her child always did. I had this student who was so down on himself. His intuition for math was great, and he would understand everything in class, but then there was no follow through, no effort on homework or anything. At parent-teacher conferences he had almost failed my class, but I let him do MacUp work and he just barely made it. I spoke to him in front of his father and I said, I think he can do better than this. The father looked at him and said, I don't think he can. I think this is your best. I'm not supposed to contradict parents, but I said, I think he will prove you wrong. I realized his father constantly shits on him, so he has no motivation. Kid ended up getting expelled shortly after for something unrelated. A couple years ago, when I taught 8th grade social studies, this one female student, a real nice girl and somewhat quiet and reserved, but she had a huge attendance problem. A good week would be her showing up twice. To her credit, when she came back she would at least make an attempt to make up the work, but when you miss 3 to 4 days a week it's a shit ton of work to make up. She had already failed the 8th grade once, and apparently 6th grade too, and the school actually wasn't afraid to hold her back again. So during May, with about 1 month left, we started having parent conferences for those who have students in danger of not moving to 9th grade. Mum comes in wearing pajamas, her guts sticking out of her shirt, carrying nothing but her phone and her Newport cigs. We start explaining the situation to Mum, and she couldn't care less. She told us she's probably off with her boyfriend, a 21-year-old, actually a former student of mine as well. Mum kept paying her cell phone bill, let the 21-year-old boyfriend crash at their house occasionally, etc. I'd show Mom examples of the work her daughter was capable of, and was completely indifferent to it. Everything clicked to me upon meeting Mum. She was essentially encouraging her daughter not to care about school. It's a shame, because the student was really bright and a sweet kid, and had so much potential with even mediocre support at home. Mum was probably raised the same way, and just everything made sense to me. I had an extremely self-absorbed and arrogant student. The only person in real life I've ever heard use the phrase, "Do you know who I am?" Apparently he had won some local sports contest, and he really wanted to impress this younger student. He harassed every girl in the school. The first conversation I had with his mother, she sniveled, "You do know this is a sports school, right? Not an academic school." Click. About 14 years ago I was an ESL teacher, and had a student who, for lack of a better way to describe him, was like a feral animal. Many of my students were the children of migrant workers who would come and go through the fall and spring, so my class had a sort of revolving door of kids year round. This student was 15, but didn't have even a basic grasp of social norms, and to make matters worse he couldn't speak English, so many of his peers and teachers would get increasingly frustrated with him as he continually broke social norms like standing too close to people, touching people who didn't want to be touched, and blowing his nose into his hand. After his second week in our school I requested a conference with his parents, and found that he had no parents listed in our student records. I asked him about this, and he told me that he was from Honduras and his mom still lived there. When I asked him how he got to the States, he just said that he walked with some other people from his town that his mom sent him with. It turns out that he was living with friends of his mother's friends in their garage in Michigan. He was literally being treated like an animal. I got to know him really well over the next few years, and he told me that his life in Honduras was not all that different. His mother raised him alone, and they were very poor. He was left to raise himself and never really went to school up until coming to the States. My wife and I weren't well off ourselves at the time, but we bought him clothes, shoes, and food when he needed them. He became a son to me, and had I been more aware of how social services operated, I would have fought to gain custody of him. He's since moved back to Honduras, but I still keep in contact with him to this day. Pretty much every time there's a parent-teacher conference, the kid who doesn't do his or her work, there's a good chance that the parent's too busy on their phone to actually pay attention to what's going on. The kid who acts out in class, parents either spend the whole meeting screaming at the kid or they spend it screaming at the teacher. I do remember one specific conference when I was a student teacher, though. A kid had been having trouble with another student and had been escalating things pretty aggressively. When we talked to mum about it, mum responded with something very close to, "Well, I told her that she ought to slap that little bitch in the mouth." Gee, I wonder where the kid got it from.